Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Byerwalter, a member of the psychology department. Nice to see all of you here. And I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today. Before I do, just one quick procedural note. Obviously, silence your cell phones, right? Also, if you are a GRCC First Scholar, would you please stop up front and sign in at the end of the lecture? They'd like you to do that. Okay, so as we begin here, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frank Connor. He is the chair of the psychology department here at GRCC, and he has his undergrad from Grand Valley State University and his master's from Norwich University in Vermont, and his PhD program through Michigan State University. So please welcome Dr. Connor.
Thank you, Dr. Byerwalter. I want to welcome you to the first of 4 Psychology Department Speaker Series. Today, my volume keeps going up and down in my head. I'm hoping it's happening for you, too. Today I want to talk about the psychology of political affiliations. Are donkeys and elephants really that different? Do people who become a Democrat have something that's different about them than somebody who becomes a Republican? We know that they align with different political beliefs, particularly different political values, if you will. Certainly they have different ways in which they think about the way in which we should govern. As a psychologist, what I'm curious about is there something innately different about them? So today, I'm going to share some of these differences. In fact, over the last couple of decades, there's been a fair amount of research around some of these differences. We're going to look at biological differences. We're going to look at the way in which liberals versus conservatives or Democrats versus Republicans, the ways in which they frame the world. We're going to look at personality styles, and we're going to look at the ways in which they think about the world, their cognitive process. We're also going to talk about what might be some of the contributing factors, and lastly, ways to mediate. One of the things that I hope that comes out of this is, first and foremost, understanding. But I think you'll agree, and as we look at the research here towards the end of the slide, there's become a bigger and bigger polarity in our country, that the political divide has become bigger. And that's fairly obvious. I'll present data to support that argument, but it's not very functional. And so the first step in dealing what I'm going to argue is a problem is to understand. And so my intention is not to suggest that one party, one political position is right and the other one is wrong. But I think what I will show is that there are some distinct differences between individuals who choose to move to the left versus those who choose to the right. And if we want to bring those two sides together, then the first step is to understand. And after understanding, then there's a kind of acceptance and there's a kind of openness to the value that different personalities, different ways of being, different cognitions bring to the world. So we're going to begin with biology. Is there literally a Republican brain and a Democratic brain, or a brain of a Democrat? I know, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, you would say, absolutely not. Democrats have no brain, or they would think the way that I'm thinking, or vice versa. But what's curious is that in doing MRIs and doing CAT scans and looking at the brains of dead Democrats and the brains of dead Republicans, people who self-identify as being affiliated with one party or another, people who engage in political activities aligned with one or the other, we actually do see a difference in their brains. Liberals have a greater volume of what is the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. This actually is the part of the brain that connects the limbic system with the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system, if you will, is the more primitive part of the brain. It's the part of the brain, when I say primitive, it's the part that is focused on safety. It's the part that if a Bengal tiger showed up in this room right now, it would kick in and take care of us. The cognitive prefrontal cortex, this is the executive function of the brain. This is where we problem solve. The ACC is good for detecting conflict. In liberals, we see it firing more frequently when detecting differences between instinct and intention. So again, the primitive versus the directed. It's good for emotional regulation, evaluating, weighing different competing choices. It keeps emotions in check to allow cognitive processes to work. One of the criticisms of those on the left is that they're so aloof. They don't demonstrate emotions. They view every situation as if it is not important to them. Well, this would in part explain that. Whether for good or bad, they have the capacity to remove themselves from their emotions. On the other hand, conservatives have greater volume in the amygdala. The amygdala is that part that responds to emotion, that responds to those things in the environment that we evaluate as threatening or dangerous. It makes us afraid of things that are outside of our control. If I don't understand it, I find it a little scary. In planned experiments with risky decision-making, it fires more rapidly in Republicans. So, of course, the advantage and disadvantage to that is Republicans tend to be, or those to the right, tend to be more impassioned about their beliefs and their decisions. But as liberals are oftentimes being criticized as being aloof, not really having an emotional connection to something, Republicans are oftentimes criticized for the opposite. You're just too emotional. Here's the facts. Here's the logic. In fact, there's a whole body of literature that has emerged which looks at what stimuli do people pay more attention to based on their political preference. When showing a group of images, these on the left were labeled negative stimuli by Dodd and his colleagues. Now, I didn't want to have really negative stimuli, but some examples were people eating worms. Well, this is a gummy worm. I didn't want to get anybody upset by seeing somebody actually eating a bunch of worms. Wounds. I tried to find a picture of fake wounds. They look just as bad as real wounds. So you got a Band-Aid. Versus looking at pleasant things like bunnies and smiling children. And then measuring the gaze. How long does one group stare at these images more than others? And what Dodd found is that conservatives paid more attention to negative stimuli. They looked at those things that were scary or disgusting more often, whereas liberals tend to look at the pleasant images longer. In a similar experiment where they were presented with information that they had to memorize, both in images and words, conservatives remembered 90% of negative images and only 80% of positive images. Liberals were essentially the same. 84% of negative images and 86% of positives. When I mean the same is there really wasn't much difference between them. When you do a statistical analysis of political affiliation and focus on negative images, it accounts for 45% of the variance, or 45% of what they believe can be attributed simply or evaluated simply by this alone. So what does that mean to us? Hibbing has suggested that conservatives are physiologically more attuned to negative, threatening, disgusting stimuli in their environment. This connects very clearly to their ideology. This is why they're centered on a strong military, tough law enforcement. They're resistant to immigration, widespread availability of guns. These all fit the idea of their biology that we have to be prepared for the unknown. We have to be prepared for that which is scary. They pay more attention to the scary parts of the world. Now, that's not a bad thing. By itself, it's focusing on those things that are a problem, those things that can get us. At some point in the evolution of our species, things that would kill us. In measuring the ways in which the two groups think, those of you who've taken psychology classes, you know the difference between low-level thinking and high-level automatic thinking versus controlled thinking. When measuring activity, conservatives preferred and were more active when it was low-level thinking, when things were easier to process. But as you know, those of you in psychology, low-level thinking is basic, normal, and natural. We do it more than anything else. It is a survival technique. You can't process everything. It's one of the criticisms of liberals, right? You're always thinking about stuff and never getting anything done. You're always processing. You're always asking one more question. Because liberals thought, oh, there's a T right there. Imagine a T. Their thought process increases with novelty. They like to think about things over and over and over. The more novel the idea, the more active their brain. In doing twin studies, looking at inherited dispositions, ways in which people perceive the world, breaking it down into 3 different sections. Distribution of resources, individualistic versus collectivist, that we should focus on the individual or we should focus on the whole. These really are dichotomies. Outsiders and in-group, so people who belong in your group or people who are outside of your group. Do you see them as threatening or is it enticing? And how do we organize power structures? Is it hierarchical? You have a boss who tells everybody what to do? Or is it egalitarian? We all get to decide. 40% of these dispositions can be measured through DNA. That what one parent, well, 2 parents, pass on to their children, 40% of it can be predicted simply through DNA. Whether you are individualistic or whether you enjoy in-groups or you're hierarchical. And this is strongly correlated with party affiliation. So the DNA of your parents accounts for about 40% of what you believe about resources, people, and power. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, parties have aligned themselves around these same concepts. Parties are made up. Political parties are socially constructed. People align themselves with a platform that is associated with a party. Some parties create a platform that attracts one group, and some parties create a platform that attracts another. Here's something that's maybe a little controversial. I mean, this is not really controversial to this point. There's no right or wrong in these issues. Now, this is a little bit more controversial though, but the research is pretty robust. Low scores on IQ tests in childhood is a predictor of higher in-group, out-group mentality and socially conservative politics in adulthood. We're not suggesting, the data doesn't suggest, that the Republican Party is less intelligent than the Democratic Party. That's not what these data says. These data say, however, children with low IQ tend to gravitate towards the political right, and probably because their solutions as presented tend to be simpler and easier to grasp. It's not suggesting that these are wrong, but they're not caught up in all of this novelty and creativity and the complexity of the thinking that is oftentimes associated with the left. But of course, it's been constructed that way because people on the left like novelty. Conservative brain, based on the research on biology, is wired for a world that is dangerous, scary, and short-lived. It's defensive, it doesn't like risk, it's very hierarchical, and it's very tribal. A liberal brain is wired for a world that is ever-changing, technological, and safe. It's open, risk-seeking, unstructured, and independent. These are polarities. These are the opposite ends of a spectrum, of a continuum. Again, they're not right or wrong. Any given time, we need both of these. Liberalism is adaptivity. They don't mind change, they prefer it. They seek out data and analysis. Conservatism is stability. They need to find personal value to decide on something. It has to have personal meaning. It needs to trigger an emotion. So now let's talk about mindset. There's a wonderful little experimental game called BeanFest. And in BeanFest, it presents to you random beans with different shapes, different attributes, different sizes. And the goal is to develop, to begin to understand the beans and know which beans provide high points and which beans provide low points. And of course, you want to collect lots of points. In giving a group of individuals this video game to play, and then after organizing them into two groups based on the way in which they played BeanFest, and then collecting information on political affiliation. So when the game started out, they were not organized by politics. When the game started out, they just played the game. But after organizing them based on self-declared politics, here's what they found. That liberals tried lots of different beans. They were highly motivated to keep trying. Oh, here's a unique bean, here's a unique bean, here's a unique bean, which means they gained a lot, but they also lost a lot. Because they were focused on getting to know lots of different beans, the qualities of lots of different beans, and which is what they did. They learned a lot about different beans. But at any given time, they were winning by a lot. At any given time, they were losing by a lot. Because they were more interested in the creativity of learning about the beans than just sort of a methodological approach. Whereas people then identified as conservative, they played defensively. They tested fewer beans. They were concerned about getting beans that might take away points, but that also meant they lost less. But they also knew less about the spectrum of beans. So again, there's not a right or wrong here. It's a different way in which you approach the world. According to Stern, conservatives and moderates have a false consensus about the world. False consensus is the overestimation that more people believe what you believe than really do. False consensus is the idea, I believe this is true, so everybody else must believe it's true as well. My social psych students are already nodding their head. Well, of course, Dr. Connor, we knew that. You just taught that a couple chapters ago. Liberals, however, are caught up in false uniqueness. Liberals tend to think, I'm the only one who believes this. I'm the only one who knows this information. I know more about this subject than most people. My beliefs are unique. As we'll continue to look, liberals like to think they're unique. Which makes liberals really hard to organize as a group. If you go up to a conservative on the street and ask them what they believe, they can give you a pretty concrete list. Here's what I believe. Boom, boom, boom. Go up to a liberal on the street and ask him or her what they believe. You better bring a glass of water, because and when you're done talking, you're still not quite sure what they believe, because it's sort of all over the place. But they're pretty sure that they're the ones who believe it more than anybody else. What motivates liberals and what motivates conservatives? Liberals are motivated by the rights of the weaker members of society. Liberals focus on limiting harmful effects of society. Liberals are focused on innovation. Let's not have pesticides. Let's think of 6 different ways to solve this problem. We might never solve it, but we got a bunch of good ways. Conservatives, however, are very focused on laws, institutions, customs, and religions. They're motivated by maintaining order and social norms. They want to put constraints on how much society moves. If we go back to biology, this makes sense though, right? If you go back to the way in which liberals see the world versus the way in which conservatives see the world, it makes sense. I like innovation if I'm a liberal, so let's just keep doing stuff. My brain likes stimulation. But if I'm a conservative and my amygdala kicks in and says, that might kill you. Well, you know what? The current order doesn't kill me, so let's keep it the way it is. Liberals are approach motivated. They focus on group needs, social welfare, and the advancement of society. Conservatives are avoidance motivated. They're concerned about social losses, constraints. They don't want bad things to happen. They're more concerned about bad things happening than they are good things happening. It's not a bad thing. You know, some of you don't like to go to the casino. I don't like to go to the casino. It's kind of dark, but you don't like to go to the casino because you don't want to lose money. That is avoidance motivated. Creating policy. In a planned experiment where individuals were asked, in making policy decisions, when government makes policy, on a scale of 10 to 1, should they only use science in making decisions? Should they use science and other considerations, or should they ignore science completely? And they were presented first with a simple question: what do you believe about this? The mean was 6.4 for all participants. So slightly above. So let's lean towards science, but let's also consider some other things in making policy decisions. Then when they were presented with a series of questions like climate change, legalizing drug use, fetal viability, etc., here's what it came out to. Independents, 5.84. So they were slightly above science and other considerations. Conservatives were actually not that much different. Slightly above on science and considerations, but look at liberals. Way above. When it comes to thinking about science, liberals actually are the outliers. When you're using science only and not looking at other considerations. When we evaluate cognitive style, liberals have a high need for cognition. They find challenging cognitive tasks inherently satisfying and desirable. They like to think. They like to argue. They like to collect data and analyze the data. Whereas conservatives, they need closure. They want an answer. They don't like uncertain and unpleasant situations. Give me an answer. Make it simple. Make it clear. Let's move on. Let's not waste time debating over and over and over. Again, going back to twin studies just on cognitive styles, we can show that need for cognition through DNA accounts for about 40% of a person's cognitive style. The need for cognition, cognitive style, is represented at about 40% through DNA. Whereas need for closure is at about 37%. So it's pretty even. We're going to talk about family in a little bit. We do know that there's a strong relationship between family and political preference, although surprisingly not as much as a cause and effect as most people think. But regardless of family, the environment of your family, the way in which you were raised, 40% of it simply is embedded in your DNA. There's a whole body of literature around the idea of identity. In fact, we'll look at this in relationship to science in a little bit, decision making. But we know that political beliefs are linked to a person's worldview and identity. If you ask a person to change his or her worldview, it threatens a person's sense of self. People strongly identify themselves as being on the left or the right. If you have to, and you've come there for a variety of reasons, but a big part of it is simple biology as we're looking at. There's more to it as we'll continue to unfold. But once I've identified myself, to ask somebody to change is asking them to change their perception of themselves. in fact, those of you who know the work in cognitive dissonance, Festinger, Aronson, et cetera, which again, the social science students, social psych students, they got that one down. Haidt talks about this in a different way. First, when gut feelings are present, dispassionate reason is rare. In fact, many people struggle to fabricate harmful consequences that could justify their based condemnation. And when asked to come up with arguments against their emotions, what you find is, left or right, people become stronger in their position, in particular, if they don't have a good argument for why they believe something. So oftentimes, if you have a friend, a colleague, whomever, and you want to change their mind, you argue with them. Here's the facts. How could you believe it as being something else? If they can't argue the point in their favor, either because maybe there isn't an argument, or maybe there is and they just don't know it, what they end up doing afterwards is actually believing their point even more because of the emotional conflict they feel. I don't know why I believe this, but I really do. It's part of my identity. It's who I am. I can't argue it away, but surprisingly, they end up actually believing it more. So if you have a friend, a colleague, a family member that you want to convince politically to think something different, don't argue with them. It will actually defeat your purpose. They'll actually walk away believing it more so than before you started the conversation. Another little piece of information, authoritarian parenting style is linked with political conservatism. Children who grow up in an authoritarian home tend to be more conservative than those that don't. Authoritarian home, now I'm not talking about an abusive home. What we're talking about is those of you who've had developmental psych, you understand this one. This is the idea that you create lots of structure. It's the parents decide the rules. There's very little negotiation. As long as you follow the rules, everything's fine. If you don't, then there's severe punishment, or some form of punishment. Doesn't have to be severe. These folks tend to be more conservative. Now, the difficulty with this, these are correlational data. Nobody performed an experiment. Nobody went to Butterworth and said, okay, on all of these kids that are born, half of you, we're going to pull you out and we're going to put you in a home with this kind of parenting style, and half of you in a home with this kind of parenting style, and we're going to see how you grow up and what your political affiliation is. Obviously, that's unethical and undoable. So it's correlational. So we know there are other factors. What kind of person would use this parenting type technique? What would be their own philosophy about raising children? The good thing about authoritarian parenting style is that, your goal is to keep your children from getting hurt. It's a primary goal. The world's a little scary out there, and I'm going to make sure that we keep it nice and tight and closed so you're going to be safe. That fits very much with the biological cognitive model of the political right. Let's create the world, let's make a safe world. So let's move on to personality. Many of you have been introduced to the Big Five trait theory in personality. It's a robust model that looks at 5 different traits that both separately and together combine to make a person. Openness, which is your desire for new experiences. Conscientiousness, your desire to do the right thing. Extroversion is your desire to interact with lots of other people all the time. Agreeableness, your desire to go along with others. And narcissism, your level of anxiety. lots of information on the Big Five trait theory. If you haven't run across it, we could spend literally a whole class teaching it, but that's generally what it comes down to. Well, we could probably, hopefully at this point, almost predict that liberals are high on openness, conservatives are high on conscientiousness. Liberals like to explore, try new things, meet new people. Conservatives, they prefer order, structure, and stability. Personality profiles, the five-trait theory is generally considered to be innate. I could have put this under the biology section just as well. While it is true over time, high-functioning adults do learn how to moderate their personality traits. So if you are somebody who's highly anxious, so if you're high on the neuroticism scale, you learn how to manage your anxiety, but it's probably still there. So this does tend to be an innate characteristic. So as I said, I could have easily put it in the biology piece. It's not typically considered to be learned. It can be shaped, but not learned. So we can assume that people who affiliate with liberalism are born higher on the openness scale. And those who affiliate with conservatism are born higher on conscientiousness. You can count on this person to get things done and do the right thing. They're going to follow the rules. You can count on this person to come up with some creative ideas. You know, this is the person who's going to go skydiving with you. This is the person who will do your taxes well. Don't let this person come up with creative ways to doing your taxes, which is never a good thing. Again, it's not a right or wrong. Haidt has come up with his own psychological model based on moral foundations. Also a 5-factor model looking at how people approach harm and care. Am I concerned about the harm that things will do to people? Fairness versus reciprocity. Am I really concerned in a fair world that it's fair for everybody? I do the right thing and I get treated correctly. Loyalty to others. What is my relationship with authority and respect? And what I care about having a pure world where the right things are done. Well, liberals really only fall on 2 of these scales. They're high on harm, care, and fairness reciprocity. They're really focused on, I want to make sure that other people are taken care of and that the world is fair. Conservatives, however, tend to equalize across all 5. Which, when it comes to morality, liberals have a difficult time understanding conservatives. You know, liberals, well, why do you care about respect? You know, the whole liberal movement, you know, it's about pushing against the authority figures. You know, bring down the man. That doesn't make sense to conservatives, but conservatives can more easily understand liberals, assuming that they try to. Because liberals understand the 2 issues that are important to liberals. They just don't understand why they don't care about the other 3. But at least if I share something, it's easier for me to understand. With liberals, these other 2 just don't make any, or these other 3 just don't make any sense. Why do you care about that? When thinking about others, conservatives tend to place an emphasis on politeness. Liberals place an emphasis on empathy. Conservatives are motivated for order, tradition, current social structure. Liberals are associated with motives for compassion, empathy, and equality. Again, body of research just reporting essentially the same theme, and you're hopefully starting to see this theme between the two groups. I love this study. It's actually been repeated a few times since then in different variations. Analyzing the dorm rooms of liberals and conservatives. Liberal college students were dominated by two things: books and travel posters. Conservatives were dominated by order and cleaning products. Conservative college students have far more organizational tools, more bookshelves, more cubby holes, more brooms, more cleaning products. Order and structure. In another planned experiment, this actually exemplifies two different iterations of the same experiment. Individuals, it didn't matter whether they reported themselves as being conservative or liberal. These were randomly selected individuals. When placed into an environment where they were cleaning, in one of the settings they were just cleaning an office, just a regular dirty office, and the other ones they were cleaning a lab. It didn't make any difference. When cleaning, when they did a survey after they were cleaning, people were more conservative in their beliefs, regardless of what their beliefs started at. It didn't make them a conservative, but from their whatever their point was to begin with, after cleaning, they were more conservative in their beliefs than before cleaning. Now, this one's really fun. So here we had a within subjects design. T-test for dependent means, for those of you who are wondering. The stat students are saying, oh, it's that. This one, we had a true experiment in that we had a between subjects design. T-test for independent means. Hallway. At one of the ends of the hallway was one of these sanitation device dispensers. So half of the people, not at once, but throughout the experiment, were at one end of the hallway where there was this little device, and the other half of the individuals, when they were given a survey, were at the other end where there wasn't one of these. When they compared people's level of conservatism, those who were closer to this reported being more conservative than those who were in the other end of the hallway. It's about safety. It's about being reminded that germs are out there. It's about being reminded that there's dangerous things out there. And when we start thinking about danger, regardless of our own political affiliation, we tend to be more conservative. We tend to be more fear-based. We tend to be more protective of ourselves and others. So something as subtle as just, nobody pointed it out, but these things are right on the wall. They're very obvious, right? Nobody pointed it out, but simply standing near it communicated a norm of fear. There's been a series of those experiments done associating cleanliness, organization, to shifting of conservative versus liberal beliefs in an individual. Now, I'm not talking again about that makes you a conservative, but any one of you who had been in this experiment, regardless of your current political affiliation, this research would suggest that in that environment, you would slightly shift yourself to being more conservative if you were placed in an environment that reminded you that there are germs out there. So, how do liberals and conservatives think? Is there a difference? One of the interesting things, this goes back to identity. I'm going to show you a couple of studies here that look at oftentimes our identity is more important than the facts. This research was done by Kahn and his colleagues. This is a little complicated to understand, and they kind of did that on purpose. But this was around using hand cream versus not handing hand cream, and you have to. The question, was, when does rash decrease? Well, it's here. Patients who did use hand cream and rash got worse. Okay, so you have to figure out the math. It's not really math, but you have to be able to read a chart. So the independent variable was they were presented the same charts. You'll notice that these are all have the same numbers. And actually, if you read through these are exactly the same, but the independent variable here is whether we're talking about hand cream and a rash, or whether we're talking about handguns and violence. Now, these data don't represent anything as far as these are not data out of some real-world situation. It's a planned experiment. When, regardless of political affiliation, you were presented with these data around hand cream, on average, people got the right answer. Most people got the right answer, even though they had to sort of sort through, okay, what are you asking, and which, okay, so it's this. But if you were conservative, and by definition your identity was connected to not wanting gun control, when you were presented with the chart that asked the same questions about gun control, overwhelmingly, they got it wrong. Looking straight at the chart, they would argue, and again, these are not real data, it's a planned experiment. But even though the chart said that banning concealed weapons decreased violence, they actually reported it as the opposite. Their belief set altered their ability to read the math. Okay, so this is a little confusing, right? Well, here's another one. When conservatives opposed to Obama's economic policies, this is the population, when shown a graph showing non-farm employment going up, they said it was going down while looking at the graph. They're literally looking at this graph and asked, so, how's employment done over the last 5 years under Obama's economic policies? Looking at the graph, they're being asked to report what the graph says. It's gone down. Because our identity and our beliefs become more important than the math. Curiously, though, in this experiment, if you asked people to write a few lines about something that made them feel good, nothing to do with the experiment. Well, it was entirely to do with the experiment, but they didn't know what they were going to evaluate. Just write out some experiences that made you feel good, and then showed them the graphs. They were more likely to get it right. A study came out a couple years ago that looked at scientific literacy. And it was a curious, really intrigued me when I first read it. It looked at scientific literacy, and the argument was, the United States continues to be listed as one having poor scientific literacy. And they define scientific literacy as the application of science, knowing science in everyday life, not complex science, just basic science in everyday life. And so what they did is they in presenting a set of scientific questionnaires to groups who had marked themselves as political affiliation. When asked, does light travel faster than sound, 86% of them marked it true. So 14% got it wrong, but most people got it right. But look at this. Human beings, as we know them today, developed from early species of animals. Politically conservative individuals only 37% marked it true. Now, science says that's true. This was a science test. I mean, not in a class. The earliest humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs. 53% marked it true. Now, what was interesting about this study, though, is that in further in-depth questions, many of these people knew the right scientific answer. Even though they knew the right scientific answer, they chose to mark it wrong because their identity, their affiliation with a group was more important than getting it right on a science test. So this particular article argued, you know, we don't really know what scientific literacy is in the United States, because we teach a lot of science. Maybe it's a lot better than what we think, but based on this research, maybe political affiliation is getting in the way of people presenting the answers that they know to be true. This is a little bit more difficult to quantify, but it is the way in which we're able to describe the ways in which liberals and conservatives solve problems. Liberals use insight moments and aha strategies to solve problems. We're not talking about instinct or gut. They're still going through it methodologically, but when they get stuck, they tend to be more creative, they tend to be more reflective, they tend to pause more often. They're much more likely to get the answer in the middle of the night. That, oh, there's the answer kind of thing. Conservatives take a more structured, methodological, stick-to-it approach. They're going to keep focused on this problem until I get it done. I'm not going to walk away because that would be giving up. So going back to the earlier research on science, this comes out of actually a group of attorneys who have at Yale, law professors who have coordinated with sociologists and psychologists and anthropologists around how do we solve problems? How do we convince people about beliefs that they don't already, that we know are believed to be true, but they don't? So when asked up front about climate change, conservatives tend to say, no, it's not true. However, if you reframe it before asking them, when climate change was described as a threat to the American way of life, before you were asked to do anything, conservatives were more likely to sign a petition preventing oil spills. They were more likely to then say, yes, it happens. In fact, the whole body of research around nuclear power, when nuclear power was described as clean energy, liberals were more likely to support the building of new power plants. The same thing was true when conservatives were told up front that nuclear power is a productive way to stop climate change. They were more likely to believe in climate change. What it often comes down to is that our beliefs are rooted in our values, not some objective understanding of the world. A cognitive component of morality. Liberals are very concerned about the ways in which we treat each other. Conservatives are more concerned about binding groups together, supporting essential institutions, and living in a sanctified and noble way. Nobody believes they're winning. In the research that the Pew Institute has been doing for several decades now, Democrats don't believe they're winning, but they also don't believe they're losing. In a variety of studies, Republicans and conservatives think they're losing. Not only on the political front, but on the morality front. And if we think about everything we've talked about so far, they're probably right from their perspective. We've seen the big political divide start happening in the 1980s, and really in the last 20 years it's where it come to fruition. And if you think about what's happened since the 1960s, 70s, 80s, you know, we had the hippies, and now it's okay to be pregnant and get married, and we've got gay rights, and we've got fathers who are no longer working, and nudity's all over the place, and women can now work. And now some of these ideas seem somewhat obsolete. Well, of course. It's not to suggest that conservatives won't support these particular ideas. They may, but only over time, once they become institutionalized. The problem right now, for many of them, again, thinking about the brain structure, thinking about the morality, the institutions are moving so quickly that we're in danger of falling apart. Be careful of the bored person. There's a strong link between boredom and political extremism on both sides of the spectrum. Individuals who are bored are more easily radicalized for either side. You know, your grandmother's old phrase about idle hands? It's probably true. Given all this, and I'm not done, but given cognition, interesting part, given all this, liberals tend to be more neurotic. Conservatives, they're actually higher with life. They have higher life satisfaction and they're happier. So even though they might think they're losing, even though in the experiment presented, they might get their science responses wrong, they're actually happier. They sleep better. Liberals have more vivid dreams, more fantastic dreams. But it makes sense. Liberals rarely reach closure. There's always one more way to think about it. Always one more opportunity. They're constantly reevaluating. There's never an ending. Well, that's where anxiety comes from. All of the possibilities, and how do I manage them? So I suggested earlier that we are getting more divided. I think you probably feel that, but the data suggests it. 1994, 2004, and today, 2 years ago. Look at the divide. We're getting further and further apart on our political values. Oh. I thought I had another slide. I don't. It doesn't matter. So, where does this come from as we continue to look at the divide? So most people think our parents, that I'm a product of my parents. Well, here's the interesting part. Over half of children either reject or don't even know their parents' political affiliation. While it's true the more politics are discussed, the greater the identification, but it's still not a predictor. In fact, 22% of children misunderstood their parents' affiliation and thus developed the incorrect party affiliation. There's very little data that would suggest socialization alone causes people to align with their parents. We have looked at, though, over 40% can be predicted through DNA, and you get that through parents. Even if parents don't communicate or you don't understand the political affiliation, your parents' way in which they raise you, how they communicate norms, can have a strong impact on your beliefs. But the data appears to be not as strong as we assumed, that we simply adopt our parents' affiliation. We probably don't. So what else is creating the divide? When I grew up, I had three television channels. I know, archaic, how am I alive? Today, you can find any channel that supports your beliefs. You never have to be introduced to an idea that is counter to what you believe. If you're a liberal, lots of liberal blogs, lots of liberal TV channels out there. If you're a conservative, same thing. So the explosion of the media has created part of this divide. You don't have to be introduced to something you don't believe. I'm going to talk about confirmation bias here in a second, but basically, if you believe something, you can have it confirmed over and over and over by people who believe the same thing. And one of the things we know is that when we put people together who have a similar belief, their beliefs actually become stronger. Because, well, I think they're wrong because of this. No kidding, I think they're wrong because of this. Well, what about this? We get together, and you know how this works. You get with a group of friends, and very quickly you can demonize the other person or the other side. Because other people have ideas that you didn't even have. So the more you put like people together, the more polarized they become. We've institutionalized it in television. Social media. You know, the purpose of Facebook is not any form of communication. The purpose of Facebook is get you on Facebook so you will click through and make them money. Facebook very quickly adapts to what you believe. In fact, set up a fake Facebook page, set up a couple, and just click on one of them, a couple of conservative articles. Or join a conservative, start following a conservative TV channel. And do the same thing in a second Facebook page, but do it from a liberal perspective. Within 24 hours, your Facebook page will start getting full of either conservative articles or liberal articles. They seem very legitimate. And the more you click it, the more polarized it becomes. So all of a sudden, in your daily feed, you're reading articles that suggest Hillary Clinton should go to jail, or Donald Trump's a racist. It takes almost no time, and your Facebook page has focused itself to your political beliefs, and even more so, because it's really hard to have a diverse Facebook page, because they want to know who you are. They spend millions of dollars on algorithms to figure out who you are, so they can feed you the information that makes you happy, so you'll keep coming back and you'll keep clicking through. In 1954, there was a football game between Dartmouth and Princeton. It was a particularly brutal football game with lots of penalties. Hafstorf and Cantrell asked a group of students from Dartmouth and alumni to watch the video game by themselves, and asked a group of students and alumni from Princeton to watch the same video game, or not video game, football game. And then he asked them to comment on who started the aggressive play and were the refs fair. Guess what he found? The Dartmouth alumni said, well, of course, Princeton started the aggression, and the refs were not fair to Dartmouth. Watching the same video, or the same football game, the Princeton folks said exactly the opposite. Confirmation bias is a term that's used frequently now. It's one of the things we have to be very cautious of. Confirmation bias is the idea of imposing my pre-existing beliefs in the interpretation of what might be neutral phenomenon. So when I evaluate a candidate, my first question is, well, is this a Republican or a Democrat? And now I am going to interpret through my pre-existing lens. If I'm a Democrat and I'm looking at a Republican, in fact, we know this. We know that simply facial expressions, liberals view Republican facial expressions as more aggressive if they know it's a Republican, and Republicans view liberal facial expressions as more aggressive simply because they're the opposite party. So when we think we're being thoughtful, we think we're analyzing the data, the problem is we are oftentimes evaluating it through a pre-existing biased lens. Oh, there's my other slide. I knew I had one. It's actually not a bad place for it. What it's looking at is that, curiously, the divide is bigger depending on an individual's level of engagement. People who aren't terribly politically engaged, regardless of how they identify themselves, tend to not be that far away from the other party. But the more you become engaged, the more politically active you become, then the greater the divide. Which makes sense because then politics becomes a greater part of your identity. And it's more important to you. And you start talking and watching websites and reading articles that support your pre-existing bias. And you start liking political action on Facebook or whatever your media happens to be. So you start getting fed more biased information. So it makes sense. The more politically active you are, then the further you become on one end of the pole or the other. It speaks even for education. Highly educated liberals become more liberal. Highly educated conservatives become more conservative. One of the things we know that's creating the divide is mobility. If it's true, and the data would suggest it is, that the more educated you are, the more extreme you tend to become. We also know that starting in the 1980s and 90s, that college-educated people started moving more often. Like causes like. We tend to move, if you're going to move, short of economic reasons, you tend to move somewhere where you think the community is more like you. We become a more mobile society, and as with a more mobile society, we've also then become more split. One of the things that's causing the divide, there are racial issues. And I chose not to go in depth. There's not a lot of data there yet. But talking about mobility, when white are asked to think about the shift in demographics, they tend to become more conservative in their thinking. And by shift in demographics, what we mean is that the minority populations are becoming the majority. On average, when whites are asked to reflect on that, they become more conservative in their thinking. That doesn't mean they become conservative, but from where they're at, they become more conservative slightly. Again, it causes them to be afraid. What's it going to look like? The world's moving, and I don't know how it's going to move. So how do we come together? Actually, a lot of this research comes from bringing together the racial divide, learning from some of the mistakes that we made in the 1960s and 70s. First and foremost, and I think this is how I began, we need to accept that some differences are innate. The structure of the brain, yeah, we can get into an argument of cause and effect. It's true. I mean, there is a kind of, is the amygdala bigger because you were born that way, or were you raised in an environment that emphasized fear and thus the development of it? So it's always difficult in psychology to posit cause and effect around some of these issues. But by the time you're engaging with an adult, we have to accept the fact that at this moment, it's biological. The person isn't afraid of change because they're stupid. They're not afraid of change because they're concerned about stability and structure. Conversely, that liberal person that you're talking to that just keeps going on and has ideas and going to change the world, it's like, yeah, dude, but just do something. They're not being that way because they're trying to be obstinate. They're not being obtuse on purpose. It's innate to them. So let's start from that. Find common moral ground. The problem is when you argue with somebody, you tend to argue from your moral ground. It never works. Advertisers don't present to you what they care about. They figure out what you care about. If you want to reach somebody who is politically different from you, you have to have the respect and you have to have the ability and the desire to speak from their moral ground, not yours. Same thing. Use language that communicates the values of the other person. Using your language isn't going to work. One of the biggest things we can do, and we saw this Women's Health Initiative in Boston many, many, many years ago, when a group of women who were pro-choice and a group of women who were anti-abortion, and they were in conflict over and over and over, and finally they decided to talk and said, we have a common value here, which is nobody wants abortions. We just have a different moral perspective on it. Let's see if we can't come together on a regular basis and solve this problem. What's interesting about that is almost none of them changed their moral position, but they became very close working partners and some of them friends. And they did a lot of good and continue to do a lot of good. And they are bridging that divide.